Okay, let us give a little bit to spool up. Make sure I've got all my windows open. Yeah. Oh, except for that. There we go. One more time. Rename the stream. Perfect. All right, everybody. Today we are talking St. Augustine. If this is University Honors, so we're working our way through the primary document. We're reading Confessions. Why? It's one of his shorter books. It's his first most famous. Pretty legible, somewhat narrative. I'm not going to say totally narrative. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I have a shorter book of his right here. That's about half. But it's more esoteric. So I think I tried to go with the balance. But so far, Confessions has been fun. I've enjoyed this. I've never done such a close reading in a class before. So always fun. So let's jump on in. We did a little bit of book 6 last time. I think we got here. Somebody check me if I'm wrong while I get my notes all lined up. Here we go. Yeah, we started book 6. I think we talked about St. Augustine's mom a little bit, who, if you don't know, she's also a saint. To be fair, the United States is minority Catholic, and even the mainline Protestants who have revering saints, they don't always remember poor St. Monica. But we talked about this. So we talked about St. Ambrose. I don't know if we got into St. Ambrose. Somebody let me know if I think we did talk about like his open office habit of study, where he always let people like come to ask him questions, etc. I'm pretty sure we did talk about that, but somebody let me know if they remember. It's been just long enough away now that I'm like, I'm pretty sure I did, but not 100%. So if I didn't, I'll come back. But all right. So one of the first big epiphanies for St. Augustine. So what sucked him in, obviously, was Ambrose being just such a charismatic man and really good at his job, right? And we talked about this with the Chinese philosophy and what was I saying? Logic. But the Chinese were pretty honest that you need not just logic, but you need aesthetics. The Western tradition has a similar thing. It'd be the differentiation between. We talked a bit about Ambrose. Good, somebody typed that. I saw that. Thank you. So in the West, there's a difference between rhetoric and dialectic. Dialectic means the search for truth. Rhetoric means the delivery, like how you deliver truth or how you deliver ideas, because you can lie with rhetoric, right? So there's a balance between rhetoric and dialectic, because dialectic, truth, without rhetoric, nobody will believe you. Or you don't convince people. So you need kind of rhetorical flair, right? The study of how to speak to work on this. And Ambrose is famous for that. He was a rhetorician, just like St. Augustine, actually. So if you're reading this book and you're like, man, the turn of phrase is very nice. That's Augustine's training, right? He studied rhetoric too. And then, he actually was a rhetorician first, and actually today we're going to get into him studying more dialectic. So you could argue it's one of the reasons he got deceived. Where do we generally think of rhetoric for us nowadays? Politics, public speaking, lawyers. And the Romans actually would agree with that. That's where we get it. It's the Roman tradition. Focus on, public speaking power. I'd argue, though, we're losing it. For sure, people are not as well trained as they once were. So that's too bad. If you want to get better, though, there's a wonderful book by Aristotle. It's literally just called On Rhetoric. I recommend it. I've only started reading it, actually. I've read a lot of Aristotle, but I never read Rhetoric. I finally got a nice version. I'm reading it. Okay, so let's get into this. Next section is Truths of the Church. This is an interesting one here. Where's my... So St. Augustine mentioned when he was younger, he tried to read the doctrine of the church, and he just couldn't get over not being a non-believer and kind of not educated in it. He read it only literally. And let's see here. And this is related to St. Ambrose again, because he says here on 115 in the subsection 4, I was glad too that at last I had been shown how to interpret the ancient scriptures of the law and the prophets in a different light from which had previously made them seem absurd, when I used to criticize your saints for holding beliefs which they had never really held at all. This is common. This is one reason I try to do comparative thought in this class. It's easy to critique a belief somebody doesn't have because nobody's defending it. So he says here, quote, "I was pleased to hear that in his sermons to the people, Ambrose often repeated the text, quote, 'The written law inflicts death, whereas the spiritual law brings life,' unquote, as though it were a rule upon which he wished to insist most carefully. And when he lifted the veil of mystery and disclosed the spiritual meaning of texts, which taken literally appeared to contain the most likely doctrines, I was not aggrieved by what he said, although I did not yet know whether it was true." So, and this is a big... Augustine gets famous for this eventually, actually. He writes a book called On Christian Doctrine, which is how to interpret, texts, not just literally, but like spiritually, and for how they relate to the whole thing. And so he finally realized, like, oh, it's not just literal. The reason I bring this one up, philosophically, this is an issue that is run into in the United States, if you're in any of the kind of Christian religious politics. Dealing with the Bible only literally, not literally but only literally. So he's just insisting what St. Ambrose insisted, which most of the churches that all insisted for the history, is that it's literal and spiritual at the same time, and the spiritual one is even more important. But they're both true, it's just there's different levels of truth. The best way to explain this in like a philosophical or a secular sense, think about like really good authors who write good fiction. I'm not saying it's fiction, but I'm saying compare this, right? Or good philosophy. We read Plato's Republic. The Plato's Republic isn't fiction, it's philosophy, right? Is there more than one level to the interpretation, right? Is there literally what they say, and then is there levels to the depth? And can that happen in fiction? Can that happen in nonfiction? Right? Obviously it can. Any book can do that. So why can't the Christian book do that? It's a good question. And then the Christians insist God is the author, right? So if God is real, he can add levels of meaning to the book he writes. Right? It's just logical. Again, you don't have to accept the premise that he wrote it. If you're not a Christian, you obviously wouldn't believe it, right? Obviously. But to say there's levels in it should be basic, but it's even St. Augustine, it's kind of floored him. He's like, oh yeah, there's more levels to the meaning than the ones I choose, than just the pure, like, oh, it's a story of a history. Okay, now then this is where we start to get his personal turn. I've got to flip my notes. He began to prefer Catholic teaching. And it felt more true than the Manichees. And this is where he started his pure break with the Manichees. And this is a critique of the church, so I'll quote it really quick. He says, "The church demanded that certain things be believed, even though they could not be proved. For if they could be proved, not all men could understand the proof, and some could not be proved at all. I thought the church was entirely honest in this, and far less pretentious than the Manichees, who laughed at people who took things on faith, made rash promises of scientific knowledge, then put forward a whole system of preposterous inventions which they expected their followers to believe in on trust, because they could not be proved." So people tend to make fun of religious people, or people in one religion make fun of others for taking some things on faith, but Augustine makes a good logical point. Even if a thing is logical and you don't understand the proof, you then have to take it on faith. Which is just a true thing, right? Is there anything else I want here? And then he gives examples of this, just to kind of demonstrate the truth of it. Here we go, he gives examples. Then he said, "O Lord, you laid your most gentle, most merciful finger on my heart and set thoughts in order, for I began to realize that I believed countless things which I had never seen or which had been taken place when I was not there to see." He's pointing out, we all have to believe things we can't see. So why is just the religious one so absurd? So he says this: "So many events in history of the world, so many facts about places and towns which I had never seen, and so much that I believed in the word of friends and doctors or various other people." And this is his big quote, and I'm going to put it up here after I read it. "Unless we took these things on trust, we should accomplish absolutely nothing in this life." For example, he gives another great example. Most of all, it came home to me how firm and unshakable the faith which we hold. Oh, which told me who my parents were, because I could never have known this unless I believed what I was told. In this way, you make it understand that we ought not find fault with those who believe in your Bible, which have established with such great authority among the nations of the earth, but those who do not believe it. And he says he shouldn't pay attention to people who said you can't believe it just because other people believe it. Basically, everything in our life we have to believe a bunch, right? Like you can't you have to believe other people to have any source of knowledge, and to not believe other people is insane. But we only don't believe people when they're spiritual. That's inconsistent logically, and it's a point he makes, which is a good point, right? We basically have to believe everything. Think about it. The fundamental belief we have to have, even if you love quote-unquote science, we have to believe that our senses are believable. And that our minds can interpret atoms at all, right? Like, now you might be like, Professor Eisner, that's not fair. Well, it is, right? Everything has a certain level of belief built into it. So why is religious people's especially absurd? Now, if this sounds familiar, basically we've been making the same arguments like religion against religion and religious against non-religious for 2,000 years. It's been the same. It's the same thing, folks. Like, this is basically the slow motion version of an atheist and a Christian Twitter fight or something. So I'm only laughing because it's just I love to see the repeat of history. Let's see, anything else here I want. He then starts to come, so on this theme, the importance of truth, and he kind of starts to see how wretched he is. Now, as our introduction writer wrote, was he really that bad of a man? I mean, probably not. But I mean, he's still saying he's not he couldn't save himself, right? That's kind of what he's saying. We get to subsection 6. And he starts to notice the importance of truth and his own wretchedness. Now, what highlights this, he talks about his ambitions. Quote, I was eager for fame and wealth and marriage, but you only derided these ambitions. They caused me to suffer with most galling difficulties. But the less you allowed me to find pleasure in anything that was not yourself, the greater, I know, was your goodness to me. So he kind of noticed that he was wretched because he was looking for stuff to make him happy. Again, remember I mentioned how this book... We're not that different from the Romans, everybody, right? Don't we all want stuff to make us happy? Even me, I'm not a minimalist, but I appreciate that stuff doesn't affect me as much as materialists think it does. But I still like stuff, you know what I mean? I don't think it's going to make me happy, but I mean, I'd like to not freeze. That'd be great. And, have a car that runs. So, it's pretty easy to focus on stuff. It's not for sure. Now, what kind of shows him his wretchedness? This is interesting. There's two differences here, the emperor's speech and the beggar story. What does this mean? He was busy. So this is like an example of how wretched he was. He says, his misery is complete. I remember now, one day, you made me realize how utterly wretched I was. I was preparing a speech in praise of the emperor, intending that it should include a great many lies, which would certainly be applauded by the audience who knew well enough how far from the truth they were. And that was bugging him. He's basically he's writing this speech because he's a famous, and he's going to deliver it, right? So he's to get praise, oh wow, you praised the emperor so well. And then he spoke to his companions. They're walking down the street. He noticed a poor beggar who I suppose has his fill of food and drink, since he was laughing and joking. Sadly, I turned to my companions and spoke to them of all the pain and trouble which caused our own folly. He says, my ambitions had placed a load of misery on my shoulders, and the further I carried it, the heavier it became. But the only purpose of all the effort we made to reach the goal of peaceful happiness. This beggar had already reached it ahead of us, and perhaps we should never reach it at all. For all my laborious contriving and intricate maneuvers, I was hoping to win the joy of the worldly happiness, the very thing which this man had already secured at the cost of a few pence which he had begged. And then he goes kind of in the nature of happiness, right? The beggar's not truly happy. He's not any, but he points out that where he was going, to not knock the beggar, who's just happily filled and drunk and just enjoying his life on the street, he mentions his was worse. Because at least the homeless man was happy. He's like, I'm not even happy, and I'm aiming for all these high things, and I'm miserable. Isn't it better off to be the beggar? And he says this, but if I had then been asked to choose between the life which that beggar led and my own, I would have chosen my own life, full of fears and worries. This would have been an illogical choice, and how could I have pretended that it was the right one? Right, so this is the funny part, too, about kind of misery that he makes here kind of psychologically, is people choose it. St. Augustine's big on the will argument, philosophically speaking, and you could say theologically, right? But he's a big fan of pointing out we choose our own wretchedness and misery. Again, very ethically interesting. And again, it's not totally disconnected from the Stoics, right? I don't think the Stoics would wholly disagree with that. So curious. All right. Anything else you want to talk about? Nope, I'm good. All right. Any questions or comments so far as we keep going? We're going to talk about Alypius, his friend. I've never said that word out loud, so I'm trying to decide how to say it. Alypius. I'm going to call him Alypius. I don't know if that's his name, but that's how I'm going to say it. All right, let us see. I don't see any questions yet. Fantastic. Let's keep going. All right. Now we talk about the friend Alypius. And it's interesting, this will tie in later, but St. Augustine had a hugely magnetic personality. He brought a bunch of friends from home who were his former students. They stuck with him. He talks about his friends Alypius and Nebridius, and he mentions that Alypius actually came from his hometown. He was the younger families, and he was a student of him, and he followed him, basically. And we get a little bit about him. His father wasn't sure to follow him or not. And he always tried to look out for his friend. What was this? He's likely to ruin his future. What was he doing? He was fatally attracted to the games, and it caused grave anxiety to think he was likely to ruin his future with he promoted so well. And even when he wasn't a Christian, he actually accidentally helped his friend. He says, one day, when I sat in my usual place with my pupils before me, Alypius came in after greeting me politely and sat down and listened attentively to the lesson. It occurred to me that a passage which happened to be reading could very well be explained by an illustration taken from the games in the arena. It would appeal to the students and make meaning clearer, and it could also enable me to make a laughingstock of those who went under a spell of this insane sport. And he says, he took my words to heart, thinking I had meant the allusion to apply to him alone. And he didn't get mad. Instead, he stopped gambling. That's nice. So he helped this kid. He hastened to drag himself out of the deep pitfall, which, dazzled by the allure of pleasure, he had plunged into of his own accord. And this is how we get a little bit of his character of his friend. By great effort of self-control, he shook himself free of all the dirt of the arena and never went near it again. And this convinced his father to study with him. And he also joined the Manichaeans with him. Eventually, though, we get to his career. He went to Rome to be a lawyer and got addicted to another addiction, which is gladiator games. His friends basically forced him to go, and him being had such big... he's like, you can't stop. What is his quote? He'll say, you may drag me there bodily, but you imagine that you can make me watch the show and give my mind to it. I shall be there, but it will be just as I were not present, and I shall prove myself stronger than you, all the games. So he went to gladiator games, and literally the first big cheer, and he started watching, and he loved it. And he says, when he saw the blood, it was as though he had drunk from a deep drought of savage passion. So he loved it for a while. And eventually he broke free from that. So, yeah, interesting. So we're getting a little profile of his friend. We also get a second story of his friend who gets arrested as a thief. It was happenstance, basically, but he got off just from the grace of one guy who figured out who he was. False accusation. Interesting, though. I'd recommend reading it. And then we get him as a lawyer. Alypius was actually a very honest lawyer. He even got somebody tried to bribe him. A bribe was offered, and he contemptuously turned it down. Threats followed, and he rebuffed them. Everyone was amazed by his extraordinary self-possession, for although his formidable man had earned a widespread notoriety for his innumerable methods of patronizing and injuring others, Alypius neither desired him as a friend nor feared him as an enemy. So this guy was a pretty savagely consistent man. So he had some flaws, but consistent. And then we find out he's basically on the course with St. Augustine to find truth. And then we get a little interesting fight, chaste versus unchaste. Alypius was a chaste man. He figured out that, like, sexual passions distracted him from being successful in life and morality and finding truth. So he just he'd had interactions with women, then he decided, "Nah, I'm good." And for St. Augustine, he just couldn't do it at this point in his life. He's like, I loved passion way too much. And then he writes in the story, like, in hindsight, my friend was right. So Alypius is interesting like that. So he's kind of he helped his friend. And overall, he points out that he kept putting off the truth of this. I'm speeding up a little bit so I can make sure to get to chapter 7. But he put off the truth, so he kind of got the instinct that chastity was probably correct, and he didn't want to do it. And then his mother, who now lives with him, right, or lives near him, pushed him towards marriage. He even got engaged to a girl, but she was too young, so they're like, hey, you can marry her in 2 years. So, this is okay. And then we get an interesting, it doesn't work in the end, by the way. But for now, and I think he gets rid of it mentions, I didn't put on the slide, but he sent his original mistress away, who gave him a son. His son stayed, though. And then he got so bored waiting for 2 years for his future wife, he took another mistress. So this is the part where people are like, he's not that wicked. I mean, he's being pretty, it sucks for his future wife. So he was pushed into marriage. He thought about doing it. His biggest reservation actually was an attempt to make a spiritual community. Him and his friends, Alypius and his other friends, had plans to make like a monastic community before there was really monastic communities. There was a couple, but not really well established. So they had just these men together were really dedicated in searching for truth. So there was a group of 10 of them, and they wanted to make their own community. They never made it formally at this point. Eventually, though, St. Augustine does start an order of monks called Augustinians, which is literally men living in, like, intellectual groups of men living together and, like, studying. So, like, it eventually does become a religious order that's still around today. It's interesting. And then he discusses the good a little bit, and this will lead us straight into the next chapter. Let me see if there's anything I want to do here. This is our transition point. Let's see. He says, with my friends Alypius and Nebridius, I often discuss the nature of good and evil. In my judgment, Epicurus would have won all honors, were it not that I had believed the soul lived on after death and received reward and punishment for what it deserved. Epicurus refused to believe this. If we were immortal, I used to say, then we would live in perpetual state of bodily pleasure, with no fear of losing it. Why should we not be happy? Epicurus, by the way, is the one who thought God is far away, so we just have to live a pleasurable life now, because after we die, it's all gone anyway. And he just mentions how funny it was, because he was somebody who indulged his sensual pleasure, but he understood it couldn't bring him happiness, so that's why he wasn't an Epicurean. At least he's consistent. He said, yet certainly loved them for their own sakes, and I felt they loved me for my own sake in return. So he's still struggling, let's be honest. All right, any questions or comments before we jump into book 7. Book 7 is pretty intense, too, so this will be the rest of the class today. I thought, I'll do book 7 and 8, and I was rereading book 7, getting ready for today, and I'm like, never mind, book 7 is going to be its own thing. All right, let's give it a second. Negative. No, that's the wrong one. There we go. All right, let's keep going. So, book 7. This one's interesting because it's a dual chapter that's dealing with the nature of God and what is evil. Again, the best. How can I say it? Since the ancient world, or sorry, I should say since the classic world, right? Since the Greek and Roman world until today, the best argument to have with, especially Christians, but basically any religious people who insist there is a divine who cares about us, or there's something above this, is nature of evil. Why is there evil and suffering? How could it be allowed to exist in a just world? Like, all of those are really good questions. And I'll spoil it for you. Even Christians ask those questions, right? And they should. Like, there must be an answer to those, right? If there's a God and he cares, he should care. And if there isn't one, we still should care. Why is there good and evil in the world, right? Like, where does it come from? So, St. Augustine spends this chapter trying to figure out this question. All right. So, he starts pointing out the fact, narratively, at this point in his life, he was still lost. And he was in full manhood. He said, I was approaching mature manhood, but the older I grew, the more disgraceful was my self-delusion. So he's trying to look, and he had trouble with kind of his theology. He says, I was only a man, a weak man, but I tried to think of you as supreme God, the only God, the true God. With all my heart I believe that you could never suffer decay, hurt, or change, although I did not know why this should be. And he said, I understood complete certainly that which is subject to decay is inferior to that which is not. And he mentions out some things he kind of knew automatically. So he was basically still struggling with his Manichaean education. That's the way you can think about this. And section 2 actually talks about that. The manas, and I do mayonnaise because the book does. It doesn't mean like mayonnaise. It means Manichaeans. The Manichaeans on the nature of evil and corruption. This is what he's basically wrestling with. He points out that the Manichaeans were all about like the dualism, right? Good versus evil, and they're like material's bad, spiritual's good, and there's this internal conflict. But still, they insisted that there's like evil in the world, and their kind of cosmology bugged him. Read this for a review if you're curious. Subsection 2. But book 3 is where it starts to get interesting. He kind of rebuts it. Let me give you his rebuttal. Okay, so firstly, we have this, which is God made everything, including the natural world. So then, if that's true, like that's the Christian claim, right? Not the Manichaean, the Christian one. Then we have to look for the case for evil. And he mentions too, he's saying, well, then why is there evil? And he was told that we do evil because we choose to do so of our own free will and suffer it because your justice rightly demands we should. He did his best to understand this, but he wasn't there yet. He couldn't see it clearly. So then he gives us a bunch of his questions. And these sound really modern, so I'm going to give you a couple. So this is before he's convinced. He heard that, but he has to work his way there, and he doesn't know how to get there. So free will argument he's still working on. So he asked, quote, who made me? Surely it was God, who's not only good, but goodness itself. How then do I come to possess a will that can choose to do wrong and refuse to do good, thereby providing a just reason why I should be punished? Who put this will into me? Who sowed the seed of bitterness in me? That all I am made is made by God. Who is sweetness itself? Was it the devil who put it there? Right? Like, can God make bad things? Like, how do I have these negative instincts? And I point out here, where is this? He's basically working his way towards the question of, like, there's a Manichaean feeling of, it's not your fault when you do bad things. It doesn't feel like it, right? That's like, oh, I didn't actually decide to do it. It happened to me. So he's still working on moral responsibility. Here we go. He says, when I chose to do something or I did not do it, I was quite certain that my own self, not some other person who made the act of will, so that it was the point of understanding that herein lay the cause of my sin. If I did anything against my will, it seemed to me to be something which happened to me rather than something which I did. and he looked upon it not as a fault, but as a punishment. So there's this interesting kind of will thing, where it's like, there's a modern psychological concept that's just a ripoff of this, right? It's the idea that, like, when I do a good thing, it's because I willed it, and when I do a bad thing, it's situational, right? It's not my fault, right? That's a psychological kind of flaw that we have in modern age too, right? It's so easy to fall into that because our brains don't want to believe we would do bad things. And St. Augustine, basically, this is his chapter struggling with that. Again, if that sounds familiar, I mean, I went through that phase struggling with that too, so it makes sense. So then he starts digging deeper. Okay, so how do we get... So if he gets into the, okay, God created, made everything, so how do we look for evil, and how does it exist? Well, he goes into that, the incomparable is better than what is not. Let me find that. Oh, incorruptible, sorry, I should have done. Let me fix that. I used the wrong word. I'm going to fix it. Where are you? Spell check hurt me. There we go. Much better. So the incorruptible is better than what is not. There we go. Now I'm a happy man. Let's save that. So obviously, right, being corrupted and die. And when we say corrupted, we don't just mean like, take a bribe, but that's also what corrupt means. But it means also things that die or go away or that are not eternal. So now that I realize that what is incorruptible is better than what is not, I took this as the basis of further research and acknowledge that whatever your nature might be, you must be incorruptible. So he goes deeper into kind of the nature of incorruptibility here. And again, this is an adaptation of a Greek argument, right? And he says, so once I had seen that incorruptible is serious to corruptible, I had to search for you in the light of this truth to make a starting point of my inquiry into the origin of evil. So that he says here, for there is no means whatsoever that a corruption can injure God, whatever by an act of will, necessity, or chance. This is because he is God, and what he wills is good for himself, the same good, whereas the corrupted is not good. And he's never compelled to do anything against his will, and he goes further into the kind of the traits of God. But it makes sense, right? Logically speaking, if you have accepted the previous premises that this also must be true. And he keeps going down the logic tree. Okay, so now he's got to look for evil. This is 5. He's looking for the origin of evil. He mentions, though, he couldn't find it yet. And we get a bunch of his questions he was asking, and these should sound familiar. He says, where does evil come from? If God made all things, and because he is good, he made them good too, is it true that the supreme good, that he himself is a greater good than these lesser goods which he created? But the Creator in all his creation is both good. Where does evil come from? And he keeps asking, right? Can there be something evil in the matter from which he made the universe? When he shaped the matter and fitted it to purpose, did he leave some part which he could not convert good? And there's a whole page of questions. This is 139. So he points out that he's still a lot of doubts, right? This is what this chapter, he's trying to answer how he kind of worked through all of these. And again, I read them all. It's amazing. Like, these are very modern sounding questions. Because they're good questions, right? Like, we should ask these questions. It can't just be because, right? That all of you grew up, right? When you ask why and somebody says because, it's the most unsatisfying answer. All right. At the same time, he got out of astrology. Interesting enough, he had some arguments. The proof that got him out of astrology is interesting. Is it? He was talking to a guy called Firminus, and he heard a story like this guy's Firminus' dad was super into astrology, and when his mother was pregnant and a slave in a friend's household, and both his dad and this friend really liked astrology, they're like, oh, let's like research it and see what happens. Like when the son is born, who is Firminus, and a slave child was, and if they're born at the same time, they should have the same life, right? And then he mentions like they were literally born the exact same moment, and the son had a super successful life, and the slave kid had a slave life, which was pretty bad. And for St. Augustine, this broke him totally out of astrology. He was like, oh yeah, it's totally bupkis, right? Because there's 2 different lives of 2 people who were born at the same time. It's completely meaningless. So, again, makes sense logically, too. Okay, where am I going? Keep going. The next couple, he goes into kind of his own imperfection and his agony. I think this is 7. Let's see. and he mentions this is kind of his halfway point. Just in his kind of revelation, he's like, he's on his way towards being religious, but he's not quite there yet. And then he mentions too, which is interesting. Under the secret touch of your healing hand, my swelling pride subsided. Day by day, the pain I suffered brought me health, like an ointment which stung, but cleared the confusion and darkness of my mind's eye. This is an interesting idea too, of the kind of pain that the healing effect of pain. Like, not all pain is bad. And for him, he's like, this suffering process of asking these questions led him to a good end. So it's good. And remember, this can sound kind of random, but it leaks back to that evil, right? Can anything that's hard or suffering be good? And he's pointing out that, yeah, sure, this kind of suffering he had a healing effect. So, great. Somebody asked a question, is St. Augustine on his way to conversion more out of fear of God or from gradual reverence? Well, fear, when you think of fear, right, fear in the traditional sense means respect. Does that make sense? Like, in the Bible, in the Torah, in the Old Testament, a lot of it says, fear God. But it includes respect, not just like shivering in your boots, right, but like respecting God. Yeah, I think there is a fear of living without God, somebody said. That also could be true. But I think it's gradual reverence / he understands that it's real. Does that make sense? And this chapter is, I would call, the turning point. The second half, when he starts studying the Platonists, right, he literally studies Plato and his followers. He starts to see, like, oh, God is not material. Oops. Right? So it kind of like he figures out the truth of it. He would say he understood it was true. Does that make sense? Like, it was inevitable. And it was like, it's both reverence, but also like it made him happy, and it was true. Does that make sense? Like, he was satisfied. That is what he would say by the end of the book. Although he's already heavily hinted that's where he's going with it. Right? The book wouldn't make sense otherwise. It's a good question, though. Let's see, any other questions? I do not see them. Let us keep going. All right. So he then gets into 9, I think this is, where he talks about understanding the Word of God. Remember, this is both a lot of Bible quotes here, but fundamentally, right, this is Christ. We talked about this, I think, in before class last time. So he has to understand what this means, that if the Christians are right, God came to earth. Now, he points out, he only quotes a lot of scripture on these 2 pages of section 9. The Platonists are what got him here. And he points out that there's still this kind of need for humility, and he wasn't really aware of that yet. And this is kind of his capitulation of that, this section 9. But yeah, his own pride basically needed humility. And there's a lot of right doctrine here, too, if you're curious. 145. It's a pretty solid statement of Christ. And the key here, if I'm going to quote anything, is 145, halfway down. The books also tell us your only begotten Son abides forever in eternity with you. That before all time began, he was, that he is above all time, and suffers no change. And that his plenty our souls receive their part, hence derive their blessings. And then by partaking of the wisdom which abides in them, they are renewed. And this is the source of their wisdom. Remember, he's still searching for truth and wisdom. So there's this idea that you have humility, and then through Christ you access eternal truths. And then it also talks about his nature. Now this will matter too when we get to time theory next time. All this ties into time theory too. But we're not there yet, so don't panic. That's why I'm mentioning it. It will come back in his time theory. All right. So finally, as he starts reading the Platonists, he starts realizing his kind of viewpoint was off. So for the first time, he says, these books serve to remind me to return my own self. He says, I entered, and with the eye of my soul, such as it was, I saw the light that never changes, casting its rays over the same eye of my soul over my mind. It was not the common light of the day that is seen by the eye of every living thing of flesh and blood, nor it was some more spacious light of the same sort. What I saw was something quite different from any light we know on earth. It shined above my mind, but not in the way oil floats above the water of the sky, or how the sky hangs over the earth. It was above me. It itself was the light that made me, and I was below because I was made of it. All who know the truth know this light. all who know this light know eternity. The light that charity knows. And he says, and so basically he had his first kind of religious experience, actually reading Platonists. And remember, this light comparison has a the intelligible route. Remember from Plato, the cave, and then the light and the intelligible reality? He had his kind of first encounter with intelligible reality. And so it was kind of his first, we could call it, true religious experience. So, and the Greeks would have just said a philosophical experience, right? But he had this first accessing of wisdom. Like, he finally got the cave euphemism and understood, the line. And he's like, there is, I literally can see intelligible reality with my mind. So when people say he's a Platonist, this is what they mean, right? Like, he's fully on board with that like, Platonists were halfway there. And but Platonists help him see God. That's basically what he's arguing. Let's see. And then, of course, he mentions here, too, that he, as far off, I heard your voice saying, I am the God who is. I heard your voice, as we hear voices that speak in our hearts. And once I had no cause to doubt, it might more easily have doubted I was alive than the truth being. For we catch sight of the truth as he is known through his creation. So Christians assert, and Greek philosophy, before Christians also asserted, that if God exists, he's asserted in reality itself. It's empirical too, not just pure, like it's revelatory, but there's also, you can encounter him in reality. Okay, now that he's kind of seeing, okay, God might be intelligible, right? That means seen through your mind. Then he talks about beings being lower than God. This is 11. He said, I also considered all other things that are of a lower order than yourself, and I saw that they have not absolute being in themselves, nor are they entirely without being. They are real insofar as they have being from you, but unreal in the sense they are not what you are. For it is only that which remains in being without change truly is. Let me say that again. For it is only that which remains in being without change truly is. So we are, right? But we aren't truly existing, because we end our is, right? We stop being. But if God is God in the Greek sense or the Christian sense, he always is. So he's like ultimate being as being. So again, this is very Platonic, very Greek. Let's see. There goes my bookmark. Yes, there we go. Anything? Oh, that was 12 anyway. Easy. Or 11, I mean. Now, this is interesting, too. He then gets into... This is big for him, because remember, he was a Manichaean until like 2 seconds ago. Manichaeans insist material reality is evil. So suddenly, he has a shift where he realizes that decaying things aren't bad just because they decay. So existence and reality itself aren't bad. These were his biggest catches intellectually, and he's basically sharing them with us. What does this mean? Let me say it. It was made clear to me, and this is, remember, it was made clear by who? Intelligible reality. Like, he's saying, I directly accessed, like, God's truth in my mind. That's what he's saying. So it was made clear to me by this intelligible reality that even those things which are subject to decay are good. What? Why? Well, if they were of supreme order of goodness, they could not become corrupt. But neither could they become corrupt unless they were in some way good. For if they were supremely good, it would not be possible for them to be corrupted. On the other hand, if they were entirely without good, there would be nothing in them that could become corrupt. For corruption is harmful, but unless it diminished what is good, it could do no harm. The conclusion must then be either that corruption does no harm, which is not possible, or that everything which is corrupted is deprived of good, which is beyond doubt. Like, why are we mad about corruption in government, right? Because it is good, and then it's getting made worse. But if they are deprived of all good, then they will not exist at all. For if they still exist but no longer be corrupted, they will be better than they were before, because they now continue their existence in an incorruptible state. And then, could anything be more preposterous than to say that things are made better by being deprived of all good? All right, there's nothing else I want to read here. And he keeps going with his argument on 12. It's great. But he says, so it became obvious to me that all you have made is good, and that there is no substance whatsoever that were not made by you, and because you did not make them all equal, each single thing is good, and collectively they are very good, for our God made the whole creation very good. So now he's kind of switched. This is a big switch, and this is why I said he's halfway, right? He went from seeing reality as only material things to flipping, where he's like, oh, I see that, like, things are made well. Very interesting. Okay, let's see. 13. And then this shifted him too. And he says, for you evil does not exist, and not only for you, but for the whole of your creation as well, because there's nothing outside it which could invade it, and break down order which you have imposed on it. Yet, in the separate parts of your creation, there are some things which we think of as evil because they are variants of other things. Let me see, what's the point I wanted to make here? And he points out that basically the kind of physical world itself is actually great, or very good, to quote him, right? So this he goes on an exposition on 13, where he kind of goes into the depth here, and I didn't read the whole thing because there's a bunch. But the heavens ring with your praises, O God, and he's praising God a bunch. And he says at the end, since this is so, I no longer wish for a better world. Why? Because I was thinking the whole creation and the light of this clear discernment, which I had come to see through higher things, are better than lower, and the sum of all creation is better than high things alone. So he started to see, like, okay, like, physical creation, like, physical reality isn't a bad thing. Oh, that's nice. Right, and this is it's hard to think about this, but this is a cosmic shift for him, because he's going from material is evil to material is good, right? Like, he flipped his thought process completely, so he's kind of working us through this. So again, read it if you're curious. And then he realized, those who find fault with any part of creation are bereft of reason, just as I was when I decried many things which you had made. And this is where he accepted the theory of two substances, and he talks about all his heresy here, basically. And then why, though? So why is finding fault bad? Because this is the fundamental. This is kind of his biggest epiphany. He said, when I looked at other things too, this is subsection 15, I saw they owe their being to you, and I saw all finite things are in you, not as though you were a place that contained them, but in a different matter. They are in you because you hold all things in your truth, as though they were in your hand. And all things are true insofar as they have their being. Falsehood is nothing, but supposed existence of something, which is not being. And then he says, I saw two, this is a short section, so I'm going to read it. I saw two all things fit and proper, not only in their places, but also in their times which they exist, and that you, who are the only eternal being, did not begin to work only after countless ages of time had elapsed, because no age of time past or still to come could either come or go if they were not, for that you abide forever and cause time to come and go. So there's this... Why is there no fault? Because things have existence. And there's this fundamental kind of assumption under here. Where's this? Did I skip that? I skipped it? No. There's a point he made in 12. Let me see this. Oh yeah, so he makes a point in 12 that I skipped over. I shouldn't have skipped over. He says here, we must conclude that if all things are deprived of all good, they cease to be altogether. And this means, as long as they are good. And this is a fundamental kind of Augustinian Christian point. It's fundamentally a Christian point too, but it's Augustinian's philosophy specifically. Existence is good. Therefore, if everything owes its existence to God, everything existing it's good to exist. Does that make sense? Like non-existence is worse than existing. So there's a fundamental good in all things, is that they're sustained and allowed to exist. And think about it, right? Like non-existence is worse, even if existence sucks, and it can suck at times, right? Existence itself is a great thing, right? The fact we can have this discussion over the internet and we can live and feel and taste and be, like being is a good in itself. That is St. Augustine's claim. Now he mentions, why would people not just accept this? Which one's this? 16. He gives an analogy for this. He compares, like, why can't everybody, like, taste this? He says, from my own experience, I know there is nothing strange in the fact that a man who finds bread agreeable to the taste when he is well finds it hard to eat when he is sick. He says, in the same way, the wicked find your justice disagreeable, just as they find vipers and worms unpleasant. But these are animals who are created good by you. They were created to suit lower orders of your creation. Thus, the wicked themselves are suited to this lower order, just as they are unlike you, whereas they are suited to the higher order insofar as they can become like you. And when I asked myself what wickedness was, I saw that it was not substance, but perversion of the will when it turns aside from you, O God, who are the supreme substance, and veers towards the things of the lowest order, being bowled alive and becoming inflated with desire for things outside itself. So this is where existence leads him, his kind of this theory of existence, that it's like a intelligible reality experience, right? It leads him to what is wickedness, or what is evil. It's going away from God's good things, and the most good thing is God. So, but even the wicked have goodness. We'll get into how this works, because now he's digging into it. So he went back to the source, basically, right? So, like, what is the nature of God? Where does being come from? What is goodness? Okay, then we figured out what goodness is. Now what's evil? Or as he says, interchangeably, wickedness too, right? All right, I see some questions. I see some typing. Any questions so far? I know it seems like I'm going fast. I'm just jazzed whenever I read good theory. Okay, somebody typed a long thing, but I'm going to read it because it's probably pretty good. Let's see. So everything physical that God created is good, but there is man-made concepts like forms of government that are supposed to address faults they see in society, which is supposedly a deviation from God, but how does anything get done? So how do problems get fixed? I'm having trouble believing all the bad things are because someone deviated from God. Well, he'll explain it more, but it's I'll paraphrase it here. Something like, you're close. I would say, like, you're mentioning faults in society. Augustine would say the faults in society come from deviation from goods, and the greatest good is God's goods. But there's other goods, so like justice and truth and discernment and love, right? So when you deviate, so God is, using the Platonic argument, right? God is the ultimate form of all those things, and when you deviate from them, you're doing evil or wickedness because you're going against the good things, you're going towards bad things, which then would cause problems in society, which then one would fix by going back towards the good. Does that make sense? So because we can choose bad choices, that willfully, that includes the choices to make a bad society. Or, like I mentioned with the corruption in society, right? To take a decent society and then make it worse. Right? Because think about it. Like, let's say our society is not perfect, but it's pretty good. Like, let's say it's like a 65% out of 100. So it's more good than bad. But if you corrupt a more good than bad and make it 40%, you have done that's an evil. Does that make sense? Like, you made it less just or less fair, or you've taken it away from, the true intent of the system to, like, make human happiness. Does that make sense? So you can still apply this metric, kind of his philosophy, to human goods, because as long as the issue with this, of course, you have to for it to work logically, you have to kind of concede to, there has to be supreme good and supreme beauty and supreme truth, right? If you believe in those things, you can apply St. Augustine's theory to, say, human institutions. But if you didn't, like, say you're subjectivist, and you're a Thrasymachus. You guys remember Thrasymachus? You know, justice is what is the interest of the stronger. If you're Thrasymachus, you can't. This argument doesn't work for you, right? Because then Thrasymachus would argue that you just assign to God whatever traits you want. But Christians don't argue that, right? Or even Greeks or Muslims, or right? People don't argue. The most religious people don't argue that. But people who argue from power or subjectivity will argue that. Does that make sense? So as long as you can as long as you can understand the objective standard, then you can do the comparison to human institutions. So St. Augustine would not say that you cannot reform human institutions. In his other book, his famous quote is, you guys will love this, any government without justice are just bandits and criminals. Like, that is not an obscure statement, right? Some Christians can get kind of weak with government in the modern age. That is not a weak statement, right? He's literally calling unjust governments bandits. They're just thieves, right? They're groups of thieves who decide to steal people if they don't have any justice, right? Like, oof, that's like Plato level fighting words. Does that help? Person who asked this question? Yeah, great. And we're actually starting to dig down his process tree. We only have 5 minutes. So we'll start it now and we'll finish it next time, because I think this is important. We're going to dig down his process tree on like what consists of evil a little bit more. Now, why do I know more about this? I've read more than one of his books. It helps. Because his ideas, it's the old version of a hyperlink. You know, when you're in Wikipedia and you go down the Wikipedia rabbit hole, his ideas all link together consistently and make this like, he has his own philosophical system, basically. Which is, we're still coasting on St. Augustine's philosophical system, by the way. Basically, any argument to justice or goodness or fairness or equity, right? A lot of these are based in Augustinian calls for the same thing. He's very influential. That's one reason I'm reading him. Okay, great. That was a wonderful question. Thank you. I'm going to give it a happy face. There we go. I'm going to give it fire. That's better. Okay. Let's keep going. Okay, so he mentions even though he was getting closer to here, he was still dragged by his desires, right? Like, it takes him another half a book to get there, so he takes a sweet, sweet time. Which one is this? 17? Oh, I gotta flip my paper over. Oh. But he realizes he got close to the truth here, but his desires still dragged him, around. But he still asked good questions. He was asking questions like, I wondered that I was able to, for I wondered how it could that I appreciate beauty and material things on earth or in the heavens, and what was enabled me to make correct decisions about things that are subject to change and to rule as one thing ought to be like this or that. How does he judge? And then he says, which was liable to change, there was never changing eternity of truth. So step by step, he kind of worked his way towards objective truth, and he goes a little bit into the power of reason as well. And he mentions for all of these questions to be even answerable, there has to be truth above his own mind, which he calls the true eternity of truth. And again, this is that appeal, right? How can we make an appeal to justice if there isn't like true eternity of truth? You can't. But Augustine said once he saw this, he's like, oh, there's something above my mind that guarantees my reason. Now it makes sense. And then he basically here, this power of reason, he realizes his was changeable, so there has to be some unchangeable reason above himself. So he says, let me see here. I knew that I had come to know the immutable itself, for unless by some means it had known the immutable, it could not possibly have been certain of what was preferable to the mutable. So there has to be an immutable thing, a thing that is not able to be muted, right? That can let you know that there is something preferable to the changeable. And so, in an instant of awe, my mind attained the sight of God who is. Then at last I caught sight of your invisible nature, and it is known in your creatures. But he says this, I had no strength to fix my gaze upon you. In my weakness I recoiled and fell back to my old ways, carrying me nothing in the memory of something I'd loved longer. So, he got really close twice, basically. 2 strong religious experiences, but he wasn't able to quite close the gap. He was still having trouble. So he had to search, and this is like the cave metaphor, right? Like, he saw the sun, and he went back into the cave for a while. So he's starting to figure out this truth about reality, and then he bounced off it. Right? He's going up, ping! He deflected. So he's like, I don't have enough strength to get there. How do I get there? And this is the kind of the gap fill. This is what Plato ran into, and several of you knocked this out pretty good in your papers. Plato's missing any kind of redemptive element. That is the biggest weakness for Plato. So he's basically mentioned he needs a method for gaining strength I needed to enjoy you, but I could not find this means till I embraced the mediator between men and God, who is Jesus Christ, who is man like them. He says, so that your wisdom by which you created all things might be the milk to suckle us in infancy. For I was not humble enough to conceive of the humble Jesus Christ as my God, nor had I learned the lesson of human weakness that was meant to teach. And he goes on to say that the Word, who again is Christ, is eternal truth, which far surpasses the higher parts of your creation, raised up for himself all who are subject themselves to him. So basically, the gap between Platonic thought and Christian thought is Christ. Augustine believes, and Christians traditionally believe, like Christ, this is the hard part, right? And Augustine is telling us about his suffering. You have to fully submit, and then he'll lift you up. So, like, even this brilliant man, St. Augustine, needed aid. And that is kind of if you've ever heard, like, a lot of egalitarian ideas come from Christianity, this is how that is, right? Even Augustine, he literally had a religious experience, and he couldn't make the final jump, right? So Christians maintain everybody, smart, dumb, rich, poor, have to submit to this same person, which is God, right? But, like, it's an abject submission, right? And if you don't do that, you'll not make the jump. And that is where you start to get this concept of, like, equality in Christianity. And I'm going to stop there because we're out of time, and I could just keep going. So we'll finish this book, and then we're going to do a little bit of a speed read. We're going to speed through 8, 9, 10. We'll do the highlights of his conversion experience, basically. How he settles this. Because we're still kind of in that tension of, it hadn't happened yet. So, and this is him writing after, but he's pointing out, like, he couldn't submit. So how does he get there? And then we're going to do, especially 11 and 12, if you're going to read forward, take a look at 11 and 12. These are 11 is his time theory, and 12 is his, like, kind of exegesis, like how you read Scripture correctly. Both of these are pretty controversial and fun. They're controversial enough that in some books, 11, 12, 13 are edited out when they publish confessions. So I'm excited to get to those with you guys. But we're out of time. If you have any follow-up questions, please ask me in the Discord. Otherwise, thank you for being here. I love me some good controversies. We'll be back in 2 days. Remember, tomorrow's off. You don't have class with me, but you have tomorrow off. So hopefully your other teachers reminded you. Enjoy tomorrow. Veterans Day, have a barbecue with some friends. And, I'll see y'all in 2 days. Have a beautiful day. Bye-bye now.